people from that study who were diagnosed with hypertension and had filled at least one prescription between 1994 and 2004 for hypertension. So this was the basis of her design. Actually, I think there's a typo here. It's 1994, 2004 was, I believe, the plan, the time here. I'm looking at her paper now to see if I can verify that. No, 1999. The next slide is correct. So she looked at people who were in this plan between 1999 and 1994, identified who had been diagnosed with hypertension, identified who were prescribed medications, and followed those people during that time period, between 1990 to 2004, to see which of those prescriptions showed evidence of compliance. In other words, if you are suffering from hypertension and you're given a prescription, a picture, for example, an ACE inhibitor or a beta blocker, maybe your prescription is given to you with a 30-day supply. You have 30 pills in that particular bottle. And every 30 days, you're expected to go back and refill that prescription. So a person who's in good compliance, who is adhering to his doctor's orders to take these pills, would be someone who would fill these pills, this prescription, essentially every 30 days. And we would hope that that means in those 30 days he was taking or she was taking one pill each day. But on the other hand, if the gap between when you filled the prescription the first time and the gap when you filled it the second time was not 30 days, but say 50 days, and we know you only had 30 pills given to you in that first day, then we know that you would be taking 30 pills over a 50-day period, which is not a very good measure of adherence. So that's how these investigators use this data set to look at compliance or adherence to recommended therapy. And basically what they did is they divided the drugs people were prescribed into three groups: generic group drugs, preferred branded drugs, and non-preferred branded drugs. And the difference was how much you paid out of your pocket for each of those different types of drugs. If you were filling a generic drug prescription, you'd be paying $5 out of your pocket. If you were paying a drug that was one of these on the list of preferred branded agents, you were paying $20. Non-preferred, you were paying much more, anywhere from $20 to $165. And what these investigators wanted to do was to see if the adherence levels changed depending on the tier of the drug. In other words, changed depending on the amount of co-payment that was coming out of the subscriber's pocket. If we look at ACE inhibitors, for example, the first part of this figure, we notice that tier 1, which are the generic drugs, the adherence proportion is 68%. If you're paying a $20 copayment, it's lower, it's 61%. If you're paying even more for a non-preferred brand, paying more than $20, it's even lower. So for these different classes of antihypertensive medication, notice we see the same pattern. The more you pay out of the pocket, the lower the amount of adherence. So this is an example of a retrospective cohort study. So I think I read this paper. I asked you to think about a couple of questions. One was, how would you summarize in words the results displayed in the previous figure? I'll go back to that figure in a second. The question I'd like you to think more about is, what are the advantages and disadvantages of the outcomes used in this study? In other words, this study was based on claims data. And what are the advantages, the third bullet is saying, disadvantage of doing a retrospective study rather than a prospective study? So I'd like you to think about these last two bullets, the advantages and disadvantages of using claims data to measure outcomes, and the advantages of a retrospective versus a prospective study design. So the first question is essentially what I asked you before. We could go back to that diagram. If we're looking at ACE inhibitors, I could compare the $5 copayment group to the more than $20 copayment group by comparing the 68% adherence to 50% adherence. I could divide 68 by 50 to get an adherence risk ratio, or I could take the difference of those to the adherence risk difference, just like we did with prevalence data in Piaget's study. But let's talk about the other two questions. What are the advantages of using claims data like this, rather than following people up and having them come to your office to record whether they develop outcomes, whether they develop diabetes, whether they develop coronary heart disease. What are the advantages of administrative data sets over data you're collecting on your own? And one big advantage is you can do retrospective studies. If you have data from this large HMO that's existed for many, many years, you can build their cohorts as people existed 5 years ago, like the investigators did in this study. You can follow those people to see what outcomes they developed in 1999, in the year 2000, the year 2001. You can follow people for 5 years without having to wait in real time for those 5 years to go by. So you save yourself a lot of time doing retrospective cohort studies. That's the big advantage of retrospective over prospective. Looking at a few comments here, claims data was collected for another purpose. That's an excellent point. If I look at my summary here, here are a few advantages, disadvantages of those two designs. For the prospective study, where you enroll people today, you enroll people into the future for 5 years, you have control over what data you're collecting. You're going to have better quality, better quantity of data. If you're using claims data that was collected in the past by somebody else, usually probably someone who's a manager for this claims organization, probably collecting data to make sure they can get payment for services, chances are the information they've collected is not the same information that you're collected in terms of quality or quantity. But the big disadvantage of prospective studies are time and money. You have to wait for the outcomes to occur in the future. You have to wait for these, you have to somehow follow these people and record these outcomes. Now, probably the most famous prospective cohort study in the world is the Framingham Heart Study here in Framingham, Massachusetts. It was started in 1950, planning to look at risk factors for developing cardiovascular disease. They plan to follow people for 20 years. The study's still going on today. They've been following people who are still alive. They're following now for more than 50 years. That study has outlived the original investigators. That study has cost millions of dollars to do. The budget that Dr. Tiara did in her study using these claims data set was probably much, much, much less, if anything. If the data is available, all you're spending is your time and your computer's electricity to do that. So the advantages of the retrospective design is it's far less time consuming, it's far less expensive, but it has to rely on previously collected data. And as Marjorie mentioned, you have to be extremely lucky to have data of the quality, of the quantity, that's of the type you'd collect if you did a prospective study. So what I usually recommend to people when they're considering doing a retrospective study is to ask yourself, is the data sufficient to do the study? I'd say begin by designing a prospective study, if you could do it. Write down what pieces of information you want to